This is September 7th, 1994. This is Tony Lupien speaking to you from Norwich, Vermont. And the first couple of remarks I would like to make to you, Mr. Peterson. I'm sorry that I haven't got this information to you sooner. It seems that I'm acting more like an accountant every day. 7 days to prepare and 3 days to do the job. But we're going to get started on it this morning, and I'm suggesting that as you get this material, you consider it in two parts. The first part will be in reference to the printed material which you sent me. I see that you have several names in italics, and I thought I'd go through those people first with a few sidelights about some of them that I know, and then the second part of this I will do to follow the outline which you sent me in your personal letter about the town and the players and so forth which we had in 1951, 52, and 55. On page 1, which is entitled The Decline and Fall, I see a reference to Don Zimmer, and it said, did Don Zimmer play in Jamestown in 1950? He did. He played with Hornell. He and Maury Wells were the second base combination in that league the year before I came. There is also reference to Bob Shockey. I would suggest that whoever has done this piece should look in the baseball encyclopedia. There is plenty of information on Bob Shockey. Among other things that might be of interest, he pitched the first game ever played in Yankee Stadium. He also managed Newark in the International League when Red Rolfe broke in as a third baseman from Dartmouth College, and Bob was his first manager, and ironically Red ended up firing him at Jamestown and then doing the same at Dartmouth and replacing him both times with me, which was a sad occasion for me because I had tremendous respect for Bob Shockey. Shockey lived in a little town in Canada named Shockey, Ontario, and he operated a mine up there, a silver mine or a gold mine, I'm not sure which. But those are just a couple of little things about Bob. He was a very fine gentleman. He came to Jamestown having been pitching supervisor for the Pirates previous to that. A tremendously accomplished baseball man. And he just seemed to be at the wrong place at the right time. Down at the bottom of the page, you've got a note on Frank Larry from 1956, and it has some things to say about him and his knuckleball and so forth. Larry was a fine pitcher in the big leagues. And I think the thing that might be interesting to you is the way he was signed by Detroit. Howard Camp was one of their scouts in the South, and he was riding in his car through Mississippi one day, going to see a player that he had heard some information on, and he broke a fan belt in his car. And he stopped at a garage to have the fan belt fixed. And while the mechanic was fixing the fan belt, he asked Howard what he was doing. He said he was a baseball scout, and he told him where he was going to see a certain boy, and the mechanic says, "You're wasting your time. Stay right here in town and see Frank Larry. He's the best thing in the area." So Howard stayed over, and it rained like the devil that evening, and he stayed another day, and he got a good look at Larry and signed him on the spot. On the second page, you have a reference to George Hetz. And George Hetz played in Jamestown for me in 1951, and did an excellent job at third base. A very steady player, nothing sensational, but gave you a good day's work every day. He was a graduate of Seton Hall in New Jersey and came from New Jersey. I always thought that George was a little bit better ball player than the organization gave him credit for. On the next page, the reference to Emil Karlik and the story told in that several paragraphs is essentially absolutely correct. He was a daring ball player, and I'll get into him as a player in somewhat more depth when we get talking in the second section of this piece, when we talk about the players we had at Jamestown. But he was a wonderful competitor, and I was very fond of the way he played baseball. The next page makes reference to Jim Stump, who led the league and won 14 and lost 3 in the year of '51. And he was a very interesting young pitcher. When we had spring training, he was just a baby-faced looking kid, looked like a little altar boy, until he got out on the mound, and he was just as mean as could be. He'd knock you down and look at you with those little eyes and then throw you that good curveball and leave you standing at the switch. As we sorted the players out in spring training, he did not want to come to Jamestown. He was engaged to be married, and our nearest club to his home was Richmond, Indiana. And he wanted very much to go to Richmond instead of to Jamestown, and he was a little bit homesick, and we really talked him into giving Jamestown a shot and saying, if you find that you don't like it or whatever, then okay, we'll see that we'll move you to Richmond. Well, he got off to a great start for us, and it wasn't long before his mother and father came up from Lansing, Michigan to see him, and they came over and thanked us and said how happy they were that the boy was at Jamestown. After he left there and went on through the system, he finally made it to the big club, and I never could understand why he was not an outstanding big leaguer. I simply don't know what happened to his baseball future, whether he got lost in one of the wars, or Korean War, or what. But it was a great disappointment to me that this boy never became a big league star. We'll talk about him a little bit more when we get into the players' personnel in the next segment. We were having second base problems in 1951, and I got a call from Ray Kennedy, who was our farm director at the time, and he said, I'm sending a ball player over to Wellsville to join you tonight and take a good look at him. That ball player was Frank Bowling, and you mentioned him in that also on page 3. This is one of the outstanding young men I've ever met in baseball. He came from a baseball family in Mobile, Alabama, a perfect gentleman, and just did a tremendous job for us. After that first night in Wellsville, I said, holy mackerel, I just couldn't believe what range this kid had and how knowledgeable he was about playing hitters and things like that. And Ray Kennedy called me the next day in Jamestown, and he said, what do you think of Bowling? And I said, he's going to be a big leaguer flat out. He said, boy, that's quite a statement after seeing him play one game. I said, well, I played side of Bobby Dorr, played side of Cass Michaels in Chicago, and this happens to be the best moving second baseman I have ever played with. A funny story about that first day that he was with us. We played the ball game in Wellsville, and it was the last day in there, and we started home for Jamestown late at night. And there was a restaurant in Allegheny, New York, more of a bar and grill type of thing, where we always stopped to eat. And we stopped there to eat. and jumped back in the bus, and we started down the road, and we must have been 10 miles down the road, and looked around and realized that Frank Bowling was not on the bus. He'd gone to the men's room while we were getting on the bus, and we left him in the restaurant about 1 o'clock in the morning. And he went upstairs and woke up the owner, got him out of bed, and he put him up for the night and put him on a Greyhound the next day. So it was a great way to treat a brand new ball player who was going to the big leagues and become an all-star second baseman in both the American and National Leagues. But we laughed about it many times. Frank was by far the highest paid player on the club. He was making $15,000 in that league with his signing and all, but never would you know it. He grabbed those bats and the ball bag and picked up catching equipment and did all the little things that you would like to think a man would do, but who might not do it if he were making that kind of money. He was just a joy to have on a ball club. He was all-star second baseman at both Detroit and Milwaukee. On the next page, there are references made to Charlie Lau, Coot Veal, Jerry Davy, and Bob Niebling. I'd like to talk a little bit about Lau and Davy because they are rather special. I'm sure that everyone knows that Charlie went on to be a distinguished hitting instructor with the Chicago White Sox and has passed away from cancer. He was a fine young man in every way, and it was just a great character to be behind the plate. By character, I mean he was a gentleman and a fighter, and everything you'd want to have handled pitching for you. Another thing about Charlie that I always admired, he had a great singing voice. And on the bus he had some great ditties that he used to sing. And he was a good entertainer in his own little right, and he made the miles go by. He's the kind of a guy that makes a minor league club manager's job a great deal easier. Davy was a story in himself. Davy had been signed by John McHale on the sandlots of Detroit, and we were in spring training with him, and John said to me, I don't know what there is about this guy. He was a third baseman and a second baseman. He said, fool around with him. He says, there's something appealing about him, but I don't know what we're going to do with him, but take him with you and see what goes on. So I took him with me and played him at third base as we started north from spring training, and we used to play on our way north at different towns coming up. One of them was at the Norfolk Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia. And the day we were scheduled to play there, the newspaper said in Norfolk that we had a new third baseman coming from Holy Cross by the name of George Risley, and had signed for somewhat of a bonus. We were very short of quality on the mound at this time, and as we went to the ballpark that day in Norfolk, Davy said, I'd like to talk to you for a minute. And he said, I know, Skipper, you're going to have to get rid of me. I see by the papers that you've got this collegiate third baseman. And he said, I've been doing a lousy job for you. He said, I'd like to get a good workout before I go home. Would you let me pitch batting practice today? I said, sure, Jerry, you go right ahead. Well, he was on the mound for about 3 minutes, and I said to myself, holy mackerel. This would have been a tragedy to get rid of this kid. He looked like he'd been living on the mound all his life. He just looked so natural out there. So after the practice was over, I said, Jerry, come and sit and talk with me. I'll keep you on this club as a pitcher if you'll promise to follow my instructions and do what I say. And he says, I'll do anything to stay with this club. And I said, well, all right, I'll call Detroit tonight and get permission to keep you here as a pitcher, and just we'll see what happens. Well, we got back to Jamestown. Our pitching was very thin. And I said, I'm going to use this kid in lost ball games to give him some experience till I get a look at him. And when we'd get behind 3, 4, or 5 runs and we'd have to pinch hit, and I figured the ball game might be gone, I'd put him in and see what would happen. Well, the first thing you know, he'd been in 4 or 5 lost ball games, and he comes out the winner. I said, holy Moses, every time he went to the mound, it seemed like he was going to get a win when he came in and lost causes. In the meantime, he was making every imaginable balk that could be made on the mound. He was green as grass, and he had made 9 balks during this schooling period. And after the 9th one, we were on the bus one night, and he said to me, Skipper, how the hell many more balks am I going to make? And I said, Jerry, I think you've run out of them. I don't believe there's many other ways left that a human could balk that you haven't found. And I said, you just keep right on going and we'll see what happens. Well, also, I had a rule on that club that if a man got a base hit off you with 2 strikes and no balls, you lost a day's meal money. At that time, the meal money in that league was $2.75 a day. Jerry was making $150 a month, which means every 1st and 15th he got in the vicinity of $50 to $60 to live on for 2 weeks, and it was pretty tight going. Well, I had to find him 5 times to be consistent for base hits that were made off him with 2 strikes and no balls. And I'd always try to sneak a meal for him on the road. If I ran into him in a restaurant, I'd pick up the tab because I felt so guilty to look the kid in the eye for what he was going through. We also had a club in that league at Batavia where there was a player that was hurting us badly. And the rule was if you hit him 2 strikes and no balls, you got double meal money. Well, after a month had passed or so, Jerry came to me one day and he said, you know, Skipper, you're not fair. I said, what are you talking about? Well, he says, you find me the $2.75 when I get a base hit off me with 2 strikes and no balls, yet you never give me a chance to double my money by hitting that guy in Batavia. I said, Jerry, I'll tell you why. You wouldn't be satisfied to hit him. You'd want to drill right through him. Well, as the season went along and he just kept winning and winning, pretty soon the people in Detroit began to take notice. And they said, this can't be. We've got to go down and get a look at this guy. I really had 2 outstanding pitches. Stump, no, excuse me, this is 52. I had just a couple of kids, and I can't remember who were the outstanding ones outside of Jerry, but it was so thin that we got caught in a spot one Sunday afternoon in Jamestown when we were fighting for the pennant, and I brought him in both ends of a doubleheader in the last inning with the bases loaded and nobody out, and he got out of both jams and we won both ball games. Well, Preacher Rowe was the roving Detroit pitching scout at that time, and he was there for the 2 performances. So he was raving about him, and we had dinner together at my house, and Rowe said, I hate to tell you this, but you're overworking this kid. And I said, Preach, you people had him in spring training over in Buffalo and had him at 3rd base. I took him from being released at 3rd base and put him on the mound, and now you're telling me that I've overworked him. And I said, I protected this boy in every way for you. At least you people should give me the credit for giving him his break on the mound. Well, he had an outstanding year, and as is said in this write-up, we finally ended the season in Hornell, winning 4 straight ball games. First time it had been done in the final of a playoff. But we had 3 wins, and we were in a 4th game with 3 wins and 1 loss, and we were in Hornell. So I said, well, we'll probably lose this one, and then we'll go back home, give the other kids a rest that we had. So I used our worst pitcher that night. And we go along, and he's rocking along, and he's getting them out and getting them out and getting them out. And the first thing you know, we're in the 8th inning, and we got a couple of run lead. So I said, wait a minute, we might as well finish this up as we can tonight. So I sent Davy down to the bullpen to get ready to come in and finish it. And I'm playing first base, and I'm watching him throw out of the corner of my eye, and all of a sudden, I say to myself, oh my God, with the great year this kid's had, if I bring him in now and he hurts his arm, I'll never forgive myself. So I yelled to him, sit down, and I got a boy named Niebling up who'd done a good job for us. And Niebling came in and finished it up, and we won the game. Well, we got a couple of cases of beer on the bus, and we're heading for Jamestown, and all of a sudden, Davy sneaks down and he's sitting side of me in the front seat on the bus. And he says, I got a beef with you, Skipper. And I said, what is it? He said, why did you sit me down in that 8th inning when I wanted to finish that ball game? And I said, Jerry, because I loved you so much. I didn't want to see anything happen to you. And I said, I'd rather lose the ball game than have anything happen. He said, that's good enough for me. And he went back and sat down. Mention is made of Ken Walters, on a rather long paragraph devoted to him, several pages down the road. I had Ken with me in 1952, and he was a very fine young man and played well for us in the outfield. But I had a kind of an amusing incident, a once-of-a-lifetime experience with Kenny. We were playing in Wellsville, and my Tucky, my second-string catcher, had got hit in the face at the plate, and he was all covered with tape and in the hospital in Jamestown. So I was down to one catcher, Charlie Lau. Well, we were getting along and gambling that we could get by, and we get into the first of the 9th on the road in Wellsville, and Charlie beefs on a strike up at the plate. He's the leadoff hitter in the 9th inning. And he got a little hot, and the umpire got a little bit hotter, and the first thing I know, the umpire's thrown him out of the game. And I went up to home plate and said to the umpire, hey, listen, this is the only catcher I've got. You can't do this to me. You can't do this to our club. I said, we're fighting for the pennant. He says, I've already done it. He says, I didn't realize you were down to one catcher. Well, I said, this is great. I have no idea who I'm going to catch. So I went into the bench, and I said, who wants to give it a try? And Ken Walters says, I will. So he puts the pads on, and we've got the lead now. We got a 1-run lead going into the last of the 9th. The first batter up hits a ground ball on the first pitch, 1 out. The next hitter fouls the first pitch off into the screen. He flies out on the second pitch. There's 2 men out. The third hitter flied out on the first pitch. So Kenny Walters caught an inning for us, and we don't know whether he can catch the ball yet. Not a single ball came to him with the catcher's mitt on, and I've never seen that in my life before or since. After the 52 season, which had been the second successful year in the 2 years I'd been at Jamestown, I had ambition and felt that I'd earned the right to move on to a higher classification. I just felt that you couldn't manage in this class of baseball forever, and that I merited a break, but I guess I was naive and didn't understand the politics of baseball too well. So when Detroit found out that I wanted another job, they released me outright, and I was without a job. I ended up managing the Corning Club in '53, general manager and manager. It was a tragic year, both on the field and off, with my wife dying early in the year in Vermont, and it was just a frightening experience. I was released by Corning in the middle of August. I had told them when we went in over there that we were going to have a difficult time, and they had to expect some losses before we ever got straightened around. They didn't understand this. I had signed a 2-year contract with them, and they were able to get out of it in the middle of August of that first year. I was out of baseball in '54, and in 1955 was asked to come back to Jamestown to manage the club. We spring trained in Florida again at the Detroit complex in Lakeland, and it was quite obvious that we were in trouble for personnel. John McHale got all the managers together prior to the season, and he said, let's face the facts, we've got 11 clubs and we haven't got players enough for 9 teams. So you're going to have a tough time, but bear with us and we'll bear with you. Well, we had a tough time. The ball club, and every time an airplane went over that ballpark in Jamestown, I figured 4 or 5 new players are going to tumble out. I don't know how many people we processed going through there. It was spring training every morning, and we just never had a permanent lineup for the season. When you have a club with poor ability, all kinds of things break loose on you. We didn't have that great morale, great camaraderie that we'd had in '51 and '52. And after the season was over, John McHale again had dinner with my wife and I, and he said, as long as I have an executive job in baseball, you'll be managing for me. Well, the next thing I know, I get a letter in the mail from Muddy Roll, who was running their farm system then, and he said that he had released me outright. And so before Thanksgiving came around, I was unemployed. So that was the end of my career as a manager in professional baseball. We'll get into some of the details, and I'll probably repeat myself as we get into the second half of this, when I try to answer some of the questions that will arise relative to the letter that Mr. Peterson sent me. Before starting to manage the Jamestown club, I had been playing in 1949 in Toledo in the American Association. The Detroit club had sent me there in 1949 at cut-down time. I had been with Detroit until May 12th, and there was a matter of a $3,000 bonus if I stayed till the 15th. So I found a notice in my box on the 12th in my locker at Detroit that said I was going to Toledo. I must say that I was very, very upset at the time, and I went up to see Mr. Evans, who was the general manager, and told him I was going to jump the club. I was going to go home and the hell with it. So he said, no, you're doing something very brash and you shouldn't do it. And I said, well, I've made up my mind, and I said, I just want you to know that I'm a very unhappy man. Well, he said, I'm sorry to see you go, because he said, I always thought you were going to manage for us someday. And I said, well, I'll say one thing to you. If I ever do manage for you in the minor leagues or anything, if I had to get rid of a man, I'd tell him to his face, I would not put a slip of paper in his locker. The man who put that slip of paper in my locker was Red Rolfe. This was the beginning of a long litany of relationships I was to have with this man. and as the years went by, some good things happened with him and some not so good. I ended up working for him again at Dartmouth College later on, after finishing in professional baseball. However, I came back to Vermont and hung around the house for a while, and after a week or so, my wife said, "You're being very stubborn. We're going to lose whatever money there is in the rest of the season. Why don't you go to Toledo and get it over with and finish the year? And then if you want to quit, well, quit then, but at least let's get the other half of whatever money there is in the season." So I went to Toledo and as a very unhappy camper. And at the end of the year, I brashly went on the voluntary retired list, which meant I could not come back into baseball for a year, and if I did that, it would have to be under the auspices of the Detroit organization. I managed a semi-pro club in 1950 in Claremont, New Hampshire, and was doing various other jobs to keep body and soul together. And finally, around Thanksgiving time, my wife said to me, "You're the most unhappy man I've ever seen in my life." I said, "Do you really think so?" And she says, "Yes." And she says, "I know why you're unhappy. You're missing baseball so much that it's killing you." Well, I said, "You're right. You're absolutely right, but what can I do?" Well, she says, "I've done something already unbeknownst to you." She said, "I wrote to Mr. Evans. I know how much he liked you. And I told him the condition that you're in mentally, and that he would be doing everyone a big favor if he would get you back into baseball." This was a very gutty thing for her to do. I was flabbergasted. Well, about a week or so before Christmas, I got a letter from Mr. Evans, and he said he was going to be in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, and would I come down and see him? And I went down and we talked, and I admitted that I might have been a little bit naughty and brash with what I did. And he said, "Well, let's start all over." And he says, "I want you to go out and manage for us." I said, "There are going to be two jobs that are coming up. One is at Williamsport, and one is at Jamestown, New York." Well, I had been in Williamsport in the Eastern League years ago at 39, and I was never impressed with the town. But everyone told me that had been to Jamestown what a great town it was. And I said, "Well, if there's a chance, if I have my druthers, I think I'd prefer to go to Jamestown if it can be worked out." So after the first of the year, he got in touch with me, and they reinstated me in Toledo and flew me out to Jamestown for a meeting with the people who were running the club, and that was how I started to manage there. When I got to Jamestown, I met Cedric Tallis, who was then the business manager of the Jamestown club. He had been a Detroit organization man, had gone in the Army. Since he was a reserve, he was called to active duty, and this was his first job after coming out of the Army. He had been an officer, and a mighty fine one, I am sure. He was a very dignified man, very into his business of doing things right, and I could see from the beginning that I was going to be happy with this man. They had us for a dinner in Jamestown, and I met some of the people, of the business leaders. Judge Barger, who was quite a prominent man there then. I can't remember the names of all the others, and Mr. Smith. You can appreciate we're talking 50 years ago, or 45 years ago now. So the next day he took me out to the ballpark, and I could see, although there was snow on the ground, we went up to home plate, and he said, "I want you to do something with me." So he scraped off home plate, and he says, "We're going to stand back to back here at home plate. Now you look out at center field, and I'm going to look up into the grandstand." I didn't know what he was up to, but he said, "This is the way we're going to operate. Everything that I'm looking at is in my domain, and everything that you're looking at is in your domain. You don't interfere with me, I don't interfere with you, and we'll get along fine." And I said, "Gosh, that suits me great." It was a very nice, straightforward approach to the new job. I met Frank Hyde, who was a veteran newspaper man there and one of the finest men I've ever met in the newspaper business. Wade Forsythe, who worked for the Jamestown, the other Jamestown paper, which was a tabloid type paper. Jerry Lawson, who was a radio station, a radio announcer, and another radio man, Cy Goldman, from the other radio station. And these people were just so receptive and so nice. I saw right from the beginning this was going to be a nice situation. In looking at the ballpark, as I looked at center field that day, I could see how big a ballpark that was. And my impression immediately was, if I have anything to say about who plays for me here, I'm going to get some guys who can run. Because it was a big park and you needed some outfielders who could fly and people who could go from first to third on balls to the outfield, because there was going to be a lot of running done in that park. And I kept that in mind as we went to spring training. That year in 1951, Jamestown trained in Southern Pines, North Carolina, along with two other D clubs that Detroit had. One was Wausau, Wisconsin, and the other was Richmond, Indiana. I never saw so many ball players in my life of that age. They were milling around like ants on the field that we had. And Ray Kennedy, who was our farm director, who was in charge of minor league personnel, was there and stayed with us. I had never met this man before. He had been one of the oldest men involved in farm operations in the history of the game. Outside of George Weiss, Branch Rickey, he was the third in longevity on as far as farm operation was concerned. He'd been in the Yankee organization for a long time. He was a very direct person. He wanted yes or no answers. He didn't want any maybes or ifs, and this man has potential and I might bring him around or all of that. He wanted to know right now what you thought and how you were going to go about things. So every day we'd go to the park and hit fungos to those infielders by the dozen, start at 9 o'clock, and you'd still be wearing yourself out at 4 in the afternoon. And I said, holy Moses, is this what spring training is like when you're on the other side of the fence? After practice at 4 o'clock, and weary as could be, he'd say, all right, we'll go to my room and we'll talk over the day's work, which we would do. And he would ask you, what do you think of so-and-so, and what do you think of this guy? And he wanted some answers, and I really liked the man very, very much. So I said, you know, Ray, there's an awful lot of people to sort out here. And I'll never forget what he said on infielders. He said, you know what I'd like to do? He said, I'd like to hire an orchestra and a good big dance hall. And we'll put all those infielders on the floor with a bunch of girls and have them dance. He said, we'll pick out the second baseman and shortstop just so easy as apple pie. And the rest of them will be third baseman or first baseman. Well, I said, what's the secret? Well, he says, those second basemen and shortstops, they'll dance around and they won't bump into a soul. They'll just glide along and wiggle their way through little spots. And he says, those damn first basemen and third basemen will be banging everybody all over the floor. And, you know, we all laughed, but as years went by, I got to realize pretty good thinking after all. Well, we finally whittled the thing down to a normal group of people. And since Jamestown was the leading D club of their organization, I had first pick. And pretty much within latitude, he allowed me to pick the personnel that I was going to Jamestown with. He said, "You're going to sink or swim with them. Go ahead." Well, I got three outfielders who could fly. I had a fellow named Zabo from New Jersey, Chick King, who had gone to Memphis State, extremely fast for a center fielder, and Emil Karlik as my right fielder. Now the choice was between Karlik and a fellow who had been given $10,000 to sign. Karlik was getting $175 a month or $150. And everybody said, "You got to pick the guy with the money." And I said, "No, I like the other guy better." And Ray says, "All right, if you want to live with him, you take him." Well, Karlik turned out to be just what the doctor ordered. I think he led the league in triples, led the league in assists from right field, stole bases for me, drove in big runs. And you may have heard on the first side of this tape that incident, or read it in the material which was sent to me about the day that he knocked in the 2 runs to win it for us in the last day of the season. He had the guts of a burglar. He'd steal a hot stove right out of the kitchen on me. And I just fell in love with the way this guy played baseball. He was a tough Jersey kid and a street fighter type, and it must have been pretty tough for him to just scrape along on the nickels and dimes that he would get every 1st and 15th, side of what some of the other people were making even in those days, which seemed an awful lot. And he, like some others, if I got a chance, I'd buy him a meal once in a while on the road, just to show him my appreciation for what he was doing for us at this price. We had George Hetz at third base, who I mentioned, who came from Seton Hall. A boy named Lysecki played short for me. He'd been in the service, and he was an older boy. He was not a prospect, but he was a good hustler, had a fine attitude, would play sick or well for you, big smile on his face, and just loved to win. At second base, we started the season with a boy named Barbarito at second base, and I could see that he wasn't going to do the job for us. And Ray Kennedy told me that the first chance that he had a second baseman, I'd get him. That turned out to be Frank Bowling, and Frank turned out to be an all-star second baseman in the American and National League both. One at Detroit, the other one at Milwaukee in the National League. And you couldn't ask for a better person to have as a player to work for you. I played first base, and we had a big hillbilly named Sid Ford catch for us, and another kid, but Sid did most of the catching. Our pitching was thin. We had a couple of guys who turned out very well for us. One of them was Rosman, who came over to us as one of the better pitch prospects they had. And offhand, I just can't get the other in my mind. Let me just think for a moment. Yes, I had Stump on that club too. And Stump I had mentioned in the earlier part on the other side of the tape. I always felt in my heart that Stump would be a bona fide big league right-hander, about the size of Tommy Bridges, thin, great curveball, and although he looked like the most baby-faced kid you ever saw, once he got to that mound, he would operate on you. He just seemed to have an instinct for pitching, how to sidearm hitters, how to quick pitch occasionally, how to hold men on and so forth. The little details of the game he just lapped up. And outside of those two, the rest we were more or less patching in. We had different people, left-handers and right-handers, who were average for us, but these were the outstanding guys. As the season wore on, the fans took to this club wonderfully. They really showered us with affection, and every Monday morning I would get a call from Ray Kennedy in Detroit. And he told me, he says, I'll call you. He says, I call every manager on Monday morning. Your call will be at 10:30, so be there in the office so we can talk. He'd always ask the same questions. He'd say, how'd you make out yesterday? And I'd tell him we won, we split, whatever we did. Okay, he said, who's a big league prospect on that club today? And I'd say Bowling and Stump, definitely, and possibly Carlick. And then he'd say, if I could send you another man right now that would make you win the pennant, who would that man be? I'd say another pitcher, preferably a left-hander. Well, he'd say, I'm not going to promise that I'm going to send him to you because I don't know where he is. But if I get him, you can be assured you'll get him. And he said the same things week after week. Never criticize or never get too enthusiastic, but you knew that he was in your corner all the way. He came to see us play a couple of times during the season, and we sat down and talked. And the only criticism he gave me was that he thought I was playing my shortstop in a little bit close, but I counted with, I didn't think Lysecki had the arm or the range to play a deep major league shortstop. But his criticism was warranted and well taken. So pretty much that's the story about the more important players we had here. Although they were all important in this sense, they were all good citizens. I don't believe I've ever had such a nice group of young men anywhere I've been. And one thing, they loved the town so much that they made darn sure that their behavior was up to snuff, because they didn't want to have to leave to Jamestown to go to some other town that might not be quite so nice to live in and things to go so well with. Well, the city itself just threw its arms open to us. And of course, as you will know, all of you know, the city was so nice and clean. You could smell the smell of bakery, those lovely Swedish bakeries in the air. The restaurants were fine. Occasionally one of the businessmen would take me to lunch at 210 Pine, which was a great place, and meet some of the higher level executives in the city. But I just couldn't say enough about the town. I loved it. We had a nice place to live. Judge Barger let us take his house. I can't remember the street it was on, and the neighbors were wonderful to us. The next year, in '52, I had a house on the other side of town, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was excellent also, and people treated us very well there. We ended up, at the end of the season, tie with Olean, dead tie for first, and they said we'd have a one-game playoff. Well, my pitching by then was worn down pretty fine. We just had to battle the last 2 weeks of the season every day to stay in first or get back into first. And Ray Kennedy called me on the phone that morning of the playoff, and he said, "Who are you going to pitch?" And I said, "Well, you're going to think I'm crazy, Ray, but I'm going to pitch that Carlick, my right fielder. He's thrown batting practice for me a few times. He's told me that he's pitched a little bit in high school." And I said, "He's just gutty enough to pull it out for me." He says, "No, you're not going to pitch him." He says, "I'm going to call the turn this time." He says, if you pitched him and had a bad day, you'd be criticized the rest of your life for pitching an outfielder in a playoff game. He said, I want you to take the two lowest ranking pitchers on your staff, whoever they may be, and they'll each pitch 4 or 5 innings apiece, and you lose the ball game, you lose the ball game. But he said, you're not going to pitch an outfielder in the ball game. And of course he was right. I just was so desperate to try to win, but we lost that playoff game and went into the playoffs and got beat by Hamilton, I believe, in the playoff, either Hamilton or well, I guess it might have been Hornell. No, I think at the end it was Hornell. I can't right now. My memory slips me. But it had been a fine year with the players we encountered. Another thing about the town, there were people who volunteered to have our players in their homes. Just the finest people, and they treated these kids just like they were their own son. We'd get back late at night off a road trip, 1 o'clock in the morning, and there'd be a note on the refrigerator for these kids. There's such and such in the ice box. Help yourself. And they were so concerned and took care of those kids just like they were their own children. I've never met a player who went through Jamestown that didn't have something but great things to say for the treatment that he received from the management of the team, the general manager, and the city, and the people where they lived. Well, let me see what else we can talk about here. In 1952, I went back to Jamestown, and much of our personnel had moved on, and we started all over again, sorting them out and putting a club together. It wasn't as good a club in some respects, although in other respects it was better. As I mentioned in the first part of this, on the first side of this tape, what a find the Davy boy had been for us. George Risley, who came over to play third base for him from Holy Cross, I thought was going to be another pie trainer. He played third base just like a vacuum cleaner. He was a tall kid, had good speed, a good arm, a good power, good disposition. And he went from us to, in another year, to Williamsport and then to Buffalo, and got beamed in Buffalo, and that shortened George's career. There was no question but what this guy was going to go the distance. The rest of the club, we had Lysecki back. My outfield was not so good, but I didn't think the league was quite as strong in '52, and as it ended up, we ended up in second place, and winning the playoffs, winning the Final Four against Hornell in 4 straight games for a record in that league. So it was a very successful season. We had some good managers in the league, people who, there were rivalries with all of these towns, good rivalries, and we would fight cats and dogs on the field as far as try to win or lose, but in a clean way, and the managers all respected each other, talked to each other, and I can't recall having one free-for-all with any other club or any untold incident of that sort in the 2 years that I was there. I guess the most well, not hated, but the real greatest rivalry, I think, was with Hornell, because we always seemed to be battling them in the close games. And Doc Alexson, who managed over there, had played at Jamestown, fine man, and so there was a connection. We had also a great rivalry with Bradford and with Hamilton. Hamilton in Ontario had a fine ballpark, and the only trouble with that club in the league was there was no Sunday baseball in Hamilton. So we'd always end up there on a Saturday night, and it seemed we always played a long ball game. God, you'd end up getting in that bus at 11 o'clock at night to go to Jamestown with a doubleheader on Sunday, a day doubleheader. Well, you'd have to go over the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, and during the summer with all the tourist traffic and all, it just seemed that you'd never get past those customs people. And some days they'd be cranky, and I don't know whether it's from meanness or what, but they'd want to look at every ball bag and piece of luggage we had, and we always instructed the players, just do whatever they say and don't irritate them, or we may be here till 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Once in a while, going through Buffalo, this isn't very nice, but it's true, after we'd had a little trouble maybe with an umpire, a couple of heated arguments or something, and I'd lost. And when we'd stop in Buffalo to eat, I'd call McNamara, who was president of the league. This would be about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd get him out of bed and chew on him just for the hell of it. And I remember one time saying to him, I finally found out how you picked your umpires up, Vince. You drove a couple of nails across in a doorway and put a plank across it at 4.5 feet tall. And if a guy could walk under that on tiptoes, you hire him for umpires. That's how you pick umpires. We had, it looked like singers midgets umpiring in the league. And he used to growl every time I'd call him in the middle of the night and shake him up like that. I guess it was probably the meanness from the Peace Bridge coming up. But Jamestown had such a fine history of good managers. I got to know Greg Malavy, and as the time went on, he was doing scouting then. He'd ride in the bus with us if he had to go to Olean or Hornell when we played there. He rode right along with us, and he certainly gave me a lot of good advice and the history of Jamestown baseball. I learned a lot from Greg and had great respect for him. Of course, as you know, Bob Sharkey had been there before me, and I'm sure that Bob was a better manager than he ever showed in Jamestown for certain reasons. There's nothing that makes a man look good but the players he has, and that's what helped me. I was just an ordinary manager like the rest of us, but I was very fortunate to have some good personnel. One of the features of our operation was a bus driver named Jerry Cline. He was a beauty, I want to tell you, if you don't know the history of this guy. He'd done a little burlesque. He could sing a little bit, dance a little bit, little fat round man, and he'd give you those eyes like a dog that had just done a bad thing to you and look up at you. But he knew some of those old songs pretty well, and he and I used to sing together a lot. Incidentally, he had been the driver for Lucille Ball when she was a child, 15, 16, just getting out of high school. He was kind of the chaperone for her, to drive her to school and everything, to see that nobody was troubling her. So he had some great stories, and the kids loved him. He was well known in every town, and he was one of the characters that made managing in Jamestown, for me, a great pleasure. As I mentioned in the first segment of this, the season of 1955 was a terrible one for us in Jamestown. We had a bad ball club. The fans were patient and stayed with us to the best of their ability, but times had changed. I had noticed, I had been shocked the year before when I was in Corning, as we traveled up through the country and to Hamilton and over to Jamestown, the number of television aerials that had been put up during that period. The major league clubs were pumping Major League Baseball into this territory, and it was a novelty to them to be able to sell to sponsors. But while they were doing it, they were killing off minor league baseball in each of the towns. At that time, when I was general manager at Corning, I sent wires to George Troutman, who was head of the minor leagues at the time, protesting and saying that the major leagues have got to stop this. You wouldn't even get a reply to the letters, and the minor leagues were being knocked to pieces. You could just see the thing evaporating on us. There was a complete carelessness all over the country as to the plight of the minor league clubs. One of the important things I thought about the times when we had the good teams in Jamestown, farm directors of all clubs seemed to be interested in leaving a boy in a town long enough that he'd have some identity there. And so towns developed an interest in specific ball players. After this time, they started jerking the players in and out of the towns, moving them so fast that the towns never had any identification with their players. And the majors looked like they were embarking on a policy of the hell with the minor leagues. We're just going to take a chance and develop what we can in colleges and let it go. It was a completely different attitude about baseball than we'd ever had before, and it was alarming.